Greetings, comrades! Finally, the 6th level of our Russian conspiracy theory iceberg is coming to an end. Today you will encounter an unusual duo of serial killers, riots and stampedes, two-headed dogs, funerals, and of course the main topic, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin and his not-so-secret lover. Vilui Cauldrons. There is a place in Yakutia that the locals call Death Valley. Yes, another Death Valley. But this time we actually kinda know what exactly kills people there. According to legend, giant metal cauldrons lie deep in the permafrost near the Vilui River. Geographer Richard Mark first wrote about them in 1853. Local residents described cauldrons of unknown purpose buried in the ground, measuring 6 to 10 meters in diameter. They were also impressed by the enormous size of the plants surrounding the anomalous cauldrons. But most importantly, this place was truly deadly. Hunters who dared to spend the night inside the cauldrons soon fell ill with a strange disease and died. Therefore, the locals declared the area cursed. However, travelers continued to stumble upon the cauldrons. The National Library of the Republic of Sakha, Yakutia, still has a letter from Mikhail Koretsky of Vladivostok, who repeatedly visited the Valley of Death and slept in one of the cauldrons with his companions. After 3 months, one of them lost all his hair, and Koretsky himself developed ulcers on the left side of his head, which he unsuccessfully treated for the rest of his life. In 1971, scientists recorded the words of an Evang who claimed that thin, black, one-eyed people in metal clothing were lying in metal holes in the eyes. Thanks to such stories, one of the most common theories about the origin of the cauldrons is that they are parts of a spaceship, and the one-eyed people are the bodies of its pilots. In fact, according to modern concepts, the effect of the cauldrons on the human body is very similar to the effect of radiation. Invisible contamination, mutations, hair loss. Perhaps the cauldrons are the wreckage of an alien spacecraft that crashed here thousands of years ago, and its reactors are still poisoning the Yakutian land. Causal Mechanics. The question, what is time, philosophical in essence, occupied the minds of the 20th century scientists. In the middle of the century, the renowned Soviet astrophysicist Nikolai Kozyrev attempted to describe the specific physical nature of time. He argued that time is as real as matter, energy, or fields, that it can accelerate and decelerate, arrive and depart, and transport energy. Kozyrev said that time is what turns cause into effect. He envisioned time as 2 spinning wheels. The cause spins one way and the effect spins the other. This movement connects objects to each other, and the speed of information transfer through time is instantaneous. Time is an active, male force that creates and moves. Space, on the other hand, is passive and feminine, the arena where everything happens. Their eternal interaction is what drives our universe. Kozyrev's experiments sparked heated debate among scientists. Some consider the theoretical calculation of causal mechanics quackery and unscientific nonsense, while others say it is the physics of tomorrow. If the Kozyrev theory is correct, the implications are unbelievable. This would mean that instantaneous communication with any point in space is possible. It means that a perpetual motion machine could be created that draws energy from time itself. Perhaps the Soviet genius was simply ahead of his time. Cosmonaut Zero. This is a legend that you've probably heard of. In brief, Yuri Gagarin was not the first man in space. Before him, there were other unsuccessful launches of spacecraft carrying people. They either died on launch, or already in orbit, or were left forever in space by the cruel Soviet authorities. These poor souls received the codename Cosmonaut Zero. The stage for this legend was perfect: the absolute secrecy of the Soviet space program. The USSR's ironclad rule was to never talk about its failures. On December 13, 1959, the Italian news agency Continental published a sensational report claiming that the Soviet Union had launched several manned space expeditions from the Kapustin Yar missile range, all of which ended tragically. The agency even provided the names of 4 deceased cosmonauts, including one woman, Maria Gromova. Then radio amateurs around the world started picking up strange signals from space: scraps of Russian speech, sounds of heartbeats, and sometimes just the sound of dying moans. Newspapers published heartbreaking transcripts of the final moments of the lost cosmonauts' lives. The last Zero cosmonaut who flew on April 7, 1961, less than a week before Gagarin, was Vladimir Ilyushin, the son of a famous Russian aircraft designer. According to the Moscow correspondent of the British newspaper Daily Worker, Ilyushin completed 3 orbits around the Earth and landed safely. The official announcement of the mission's success was expected the following day. However, on April 12, Levitan reported the unexpected. The cosmonaut had not landed anywhere and was still flying. He was launched not on the 7th, but 5 days later. In fact, he was not even Ilyushin, he was Gagarin. There was an immediate logical hypothesis that something had happened to Ilyushin during the flight, and that's why they did not show him to the public. Instead, they hastily brought out a healthy, smiling understudy. Even now, searching for lost cosmonauts on YouTube will yield dozens of audio recordings of alleged communications between lost Soviet cosmonauts and Earth. They sound creepy, but to the best of our knowledge, they are all falsifications. But what if we someday learn the eerie truth? Demikhov's dog. Vladimir Demikhov was a Soviet surgeon and experimental scientist, one of the pioneers of transplantology. In 1954, he shocked the world by demonstrating his surgically created monster, a living, breathing, two-headed dog. He made the creature in a laboratory on the outskirts of Moscow by transplanting the head, shoulders and front legs of a puppy onto the neck of an adult German shepherd. Demikhov demonstrated the dog in front of journalists from around the world. Both heads reacted to the world, played and licked milk from the bowls at the same time. The second head tried to bite the first one by the ears. But why? Demikhov wasn't a mad villain. The main goal of Demikhov's experiments with dogs was to learn how to transplant human heart and lungs, and thus he tried to study and solve the problem of tissue rejection, but failed. In 1967, another surgeon, Dr. Christian Barnard, achieved this goal. However, many acknowledge that Demikhov paved the way for the accomplishment. In all, he created 20 double-headed dogs. None of them lived long, a month was the record time. And since the Ministry of Health forbade him to conduct this research after the first ones came out, the animals had nowhere to live. No medical or scientific institute would accept them. So they all lived in the scientist's ordinary Moscow apartment. Undoubtedly, they were unique pets. Extinction of Russian dialects. A linguistic mystery. Take a man from Kaliningrad and a man from Vladivostok. They are 10,000 kilometers apart, but they'll speak almost exactly the same. Now take two Englishmen living 300 kilometers apart and they can barely understand each other. How did that happen? Huge distances, dozens of different cultures. They must have completely different vocabularies. That used to be true. But now, if there are still speakers of pure regional dialects somewhere in Russia, their number is estimated to be in the hundreds. And the theory says that this is no coincidence. Of course, such pushing of dialects out of the seas of life can be explained by a number of objective reasons. Urbanization, standardization. In the Soviet Union, everyone had to be the same, Soviet, and speak the same Soviet Russian language. But this is still happening today. In the public consciousness, the attitude towards normal speech is clear. Only the linguistic norms of large cities can exist. If your speech is slightly different, with a flavor of regional provinces, at the very least it will cause people to give you a condescending, mocking attitude. Nevertheless, such a situation is alarming. After all, a dialect is more than just funny words. It's a way of thinking and a historical memory embedded in the language. It is a trace of how our ancestors lived and thought in a particular region. The disappearance of dialects means the loss of a part of the memory that carries traces of the history of the people who lived in diverse Russia. Without dialects, there is only a unified nation, one with the same memory and thoughts. I realize that doesn't sound as scary or mysterious as many other stories in this collection, but what if we take a broader view and consider who might want to erase a significant part of our cultural and ancestral knowledge, and why? Are identical standardized people easier to control? Irkutsk Molotochniki. In 2011, a series of brutal murders shocked Irkutsk. Artem Anufriev and Nikita Lytkin, two 18-year-olds nicknamed Molotochniki, the Hammerers, terrorized the entire city. Between November 2010 and April 2011, they carried out 15 attacks in Irkutsk Akademgorodok district, including 6 murders. In search of victims, Lytkin and Anufriev walked the same route, from the Gosuniversitet bus stop to Akademgorodok, every day for several months, from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. They would walk past 5, 10 or 20 people looking for the perfect victim. Then they would attack and kill their target. They were apprehended only because of their own stupidity. Lytkin had borrowed a video camera from his uncle and left a flash drive containing footage of them torturing one of their victims in it. There has been a lot of speculation about this story. For example, it is known that the maniacs created many groups on social networks and openly distributed their videos to like-minded people. Therefore, many believe that the network involved in these murders is much wider than it seems, and there were far more than 15 victims. But I will tell you about a detail that I personally find very interesting, about the strange dynamic that this pair of killers had. Anufriev was the brain, leader and mastermind. Lytkin was the hands, the obedient executor who delivered most of the blows. At the trial, one of the surviving victims of the maniacs even sympathized with Lytkin, saying that he was just unlucky to have this friend. After the verdict, investigator Maxim Khomyak said, "These teenagers closed in on each other because they suited each other perfectly. Anufriev was a leader who wanted to be understood at a glance. Lytkin was an executor who dreamed of approval and recognition. Lytkin had a strange, even manic attraction to his accomplice. During the investigation, he hindered the process at every turn, refused to defend himself, and ultimately took the blame, claiming that Anufriev wasn't present for most of the murders. During meetings at the pre-trial detention center, Lytkin told his mother that they made a devil out of Artyom, while he, Lytkin, was so white and fluffy. On the other hand, Anufriev tried to portray himself as having fallen under the influence of Lytkin. He claimed that Nikita had a need to kill. Interestingly, Anufriev was sentenced to life in prison, while Lytkin, who delivered the fatal blows, was sentenced to only 24 years. And then the most incredible thing happens. Already in prison, Lytkin commits serious crime. Why? He was hoping that for this he would also be sentenced to life imprisonment and sent to the same colony where Anufriev is serving his sentence, Volогодsky Pitak. Think about it. He was ready to voluntarily go to the worst hell on earth, to a colony for life convicts, just to be close to his idol again. But he was denied. On November 28, 2021, during the morning rounds, he was found in his unit's dormitory with his veins cut on his arms. Anufriev, however, never admitted his guilt, learned law at the University of Latvia, and even promised to publish a book about his adventures. Yes, in a special regime colony. Victims in the Mikhasevich case. 54 years ago, Gennady Mikhasevich, a serial killer nicknamed the Vitebsk Monster, committed his first murder. Over the next 14 years, he strangled 36 women. However, this story is not about him. He was a monster, but quite an unremarkable one. It is about the 14 innocent people convicted of his crimes. One of them was executed, and another was blinded in prison. Among them was a girl who allegedly helped her accomplice kill. How did this happen? The local police were under enormous pressure. When they couldn't find the real killer, they began to appoint them. 3 friends out for a walk with their dog. Under torture, they confessed to the murder. A man goes on a date and finds his girlfriend dead. 10 years in a prison camp. He definitely killed her. In order to obtain a confession from the next suspect in the Vitebsk maniac case, investigators stopped at nothing, sometimes simply planting evidence. Furthermore, while the innocent people were in jail, Mikhasevich tried to play with the investigation. He wrote a letter to the newspaper on behalf of a fictitious anti-Soviet organization called the Patriots of Vitebsk, taking responsibility for all the murders. The Patriots of Vitebsk fought against the hated Soviet regime. Not only was the police interested in this letter, but the KGB was as well. After all, it threatened the entire Soviet system. Satisfied with himself, Mikhasevich went on the last hunt of his life. He strangled his 36th victim and put a note in her mouth with a short message. For treason, death. Fight against the cops and the communists. This was his mistake. The KGB compared the handwriting in the two letters and studied the handwriting of individuals who had already come to the attention of operatives. Mikhasevich was among them. His red Zaporozhets was very noticeable. But if he just hadn't written that letter to the newspaper, the KGB wouldn't have taken an interest in the case. The local police would have continued to imprison innocent people, and he could have avoided punishment for decades to come. Incidentally, he was actually guarded by the KGB at the trial, not from the relatives of the victims, however. The police officers who had broken the law trying to solve the murders could have tried to eliminate Mikhasevich, who was living proof of their crimes. Of all the investigators who falsified cases and imprisoned innocent people, only one received a real sentence. Buryat Mankurts. It is a word that came to us from somewhere in Central Asia. Mankurt. A man who has had his memory taken away. A perfect slave who does not remember who he is, where he comes from, and knows nothing but the will of his master. How were Mankurts created? This method, described by the writer Chingiz Aytmatov, is based on ancient legends. The captive's head was shaved. A piece of raw camel skin, shiri, was put on it. Under the scorching sun, the skin dried out, squeezing the skull like a steel hoop. And the victim's hair, finding no way out, began to grow back into the head. The pain was unbearable. After a while, the victim either died or lost the memory of his past life, and became an ideal slave, devoid of his own will and infinitely obedient to his master. Mankurt slaves were valued much higher than ordinary slaves, because a slave who does not remember freedom will not try to escape. Now this word is used in the same Buryatia in a figurative sense. A Mankurt is a person who does not recognize his roots, who despises ties with the past, with his land, homeland, relatives. Someone who, in their opinion, has betrayed national interests. This insult is especially popular in nationalist circles, which aim to decolonize Russia, which we, of course, condemn. Girl with a timer. On May 29, 2017, users of the image boards 4chan and Dvaj found an unusual broadcast on Periscope. In the frame there was a girl tied to a chair. On her knees was an iPad with a timer counting down to midnight. Speculation about a maniac immediately began. The broadcast was originally titled like this. Then, after it ended, broadcasts with different titles made of random characters started appearing on the app every 15 minutes. Many initially thought there was some kind of an encrypted code in those names, but couldn't crack it. On the 8th hour of the broadcast, the light in the frame went out. The girl in the frame did nothing, only occasionally moving and sniffing. In the background, footsteps and the sounds of passing cars could sometimes be heard. Additionally, a live broadcast of the radio station Говорит Москва was playing in the background. The recordings of the live broadcast were constantly deleted, and the broadcasts themselves were banned. Finally, Говорит Москва radio mentioned a stream in which Говорит Москва sounds. After that, the live broadcast was cut off once again. The radio host of Говорит Москва started following the broadcast and tried to contact the girl. She nodded in response to their words. She confirmed that she had been kidnapped and was in southern Moscow. The radio station's general director went on air. The girl indicated that she could not stand and said that she did not know what would happen to her at the end of the broadcast. When she was brought into the building, she was unconscious. 11 hours into the broadcast, something broke near the girl that looked like a bottle of glass. After that, the words "Are you ready?" appeared on screen. The radio host began guessing the phone number, but the broadcast was interrupted again. The next part of the stream was short and was named Time to Kill, in which an unknown person shot the girl and then the monitor screen. After that, the screen cuts off again. The host tried to call the police but were unsuccessful. The day after the broadcast, all the details became known. It turned out that the live broadcast was a social experiment by the Black Elephant community. The captive girl recorded a video in which she expressed her concern that no one was making a serious attempt to rescue her. An interesting social experiment. Self-Immolation of Old Believers. We have already talked about the Old Believers who went into the deep forest to save their faith. However, some chose a more radical approach. For example, they engaged in collective self-immolation. They also practiced self-burial, self-slaughter, zashivание, voluntary death by starvation, and self-drowning. This phenomenon was pretty widespread. What could have made thousands of people voluntarily go into the fire? Two factors. First, the church schism, which they perceived as the coming of the Antichrist. The second factor was a sign from heaven. In 1680, a giant comet appeared in the sky. To them, it was the fifth angel of the apocalypse. The end of the world was near. Under these circumstances, the Old Believers decided it was better to die by fire and began preparing for mass self-immolations. Spiritual leaders, elders, gathered people for this event. Over time, they developed a gruesome system for preparing for self-immolation. They built a special burnt house, a huge hut with tiny windows from which it was impossible to escape. There was a fence around it with armed guards. The weapons were obtained by robbing people on major roads. Because the end of the world was coming, no one cared about sins and such anymore. Leaders and elders persuaded people to walk into the fire. Some went voluntarily. Others, especially children, were brought by force under the threat of terrible parental curses. The pinnacle of this madness was the self-immolation at the Polyastrovsky monastery in 1687. As Tsarist troops approached, nearly 3,000 people, led by Ignatius, a former deacon of the Sovietsky monastery, locked themselves inside and set themselves on fire. Such acts occurred not only at the end of the world, but also a couple hundred years later. For example, from 1896 to 1897, Fyodor Kovalyov, a peasant elder, buried 25 people alive, including his 2 young children, wife, brother, sister, and 60-year-old mother, to avoid the old Russian census of 1897. One of the last known self-immolations of Old Believers occurred in Tver in 1941. This time, the German attack on the Soviet Union was mistaken for the coming of the Antichrist. By the way, remember the Penza hermits who went to live in caves in 2008. It was roughly the same scenario, but this time police managed to interrupt them before the fire came out. Jewish soap funeral. At the end of 1945, the Jewish community of Chernovtsi, Ukraine, organized a funeral. But they weren't burying a man. They were burying German soap. Like millions of people around the world, they believed one of the most horrific rumors of World War II, that people, specifically Jews, were being processed into soap in concentration camps. Where did this legend come from? From the concentration camps themselves. Prisoners saw bars of soap bearing the mysterious acronym RIF. The transcription was born: Rein jüdisches Fett, pure Jewish fat. During the war, this story became widely known. Moreover, the charge of producing such soap was officially brought by the chief prosecutor of the Soviet Union, Alan Smirnov, during the Nuremberg trials. The story seemed so plausible that from 1944 to 1947, soap funerals similar to those held for the men were held in several countries. Today, however, most historians, including those at the most respected Holocaust studies institutions, agree that the mass production of soap from human bodies probably never happened. It was recycled propaganda from World War I, when the British and French accused the Germans of the same thing. In 1990, Israel's Yad Vashem Institute, the most respected institute for Holocaust research, put the matter to rest by declaring that recycling Jews for soap was a myth. But why was it so easily believed? Perhaps because given the other known horrors of the concentration camps, the idea didn't seem so implausible. A crush on Trubner Square. The death of a tyrant should bring relief. But when Stalin died in 1953, his death brought just some more deaths. Unlike the other crushes in Luzhniki and Sokolniki, Official figures on the number of victims in this case are missing or classified to this day. Millions of people poured into the center of Moscow to bid farewell to the leader. However, fearing riots, the authorities blocked the streets with trucks, turning the city center into a giant trap. The flow of people became an uncontrollable river trapped in narrow alleys. Those who fell were trampled. Others died standing up, crushed by the pressure of the crowd. Later, thousands of pairs of torn shoes were strewn across the entire Trubner Square. So, how many people did the leader take with him to the grave? We don't know. There is no official figure. It's as if the event never happened. But there are unofficial estimates. Estimates range from a few hundred to 3,000 people. Historian Edward Radzinsky, who was in the crowd that day, called it Stalin's bloody farewell to the people. On the same day, the head of the operational staff, Ivan Serov, wrote in his diary that there were at least 127 deaths and hundreds of injuries. This tragedy has an almost absurd epilogue. The last victim of Stalin's funeral was not an ordinary Muscovite, but the president of Czechoslovakia, Klement Gottwald. He attended the funeral and stood in the cold for several hours. He caught a cold and died suddenly upon returning to Prague on March 14th. Riots in Kondopoga. On the night of August 29, 2006, a drunken brawl broke out in a restaurant in the Karelia town of Kondopoga. It ended in pogroms, the evacuation of an entire diaspora, and the deployment of troops. Anyway, a couple of people allegedly insulted the bartender of the restaurant. 3 other natives of the Caucasus stood up for the restaurant's Caucasian bartender. They went for help, armed themselves with rebars and baseball bats, returned, and attacked a group of locals outside the restaurant, shouting Allahu Akbar and "Kill the Russians." As a result, 2 people were stabbed to death and 9 were hospitalized. Subsequently, 2 more died in intensive care. The next night, a wave of pogroms swept through the city. Cars and shops belonging to Caucasians were burned. The immediate cause was a careless remark made by a policeman who said that they did not know who had slaughtered the locals, although the whole city knew where the tracks led. A lynching began. The Caucasian diaspora was forced to flee the city, abandoning their property and businesses. A few dozen people, mostly women and children, were even accommodated at one of the Karelian campgrounds under the protection of Sobor. Mass riots occurred again the following night. The Chaiko restaurant where the conflict had begun was burned down as well. Reinforced police units, including OMON, were brought into the city. On September 2nd, local residents gathered for a rally demanding that all Chechens be evicted from Kondopoga within 24 hours. In response, Ramzan Kadyrov, the newly appointed president of Chechnya, promised to protect his fellow Chechens by sending a Chechen battalion to Karelia. Radical nationalists from all over the country began arriving in the town too. Kondopoga found itself on the verge of a real war. Nevertheless, by some miracle, the authorities managed to take control of the situation and defuse the conflict. But, you know, the conspiracy part. After the end of the Second Chechen War, Russia did not need another conflict involving Chechens. The investigation into the case lasted several years, and many are convinced that the real killers have not been punished. The chairman of the Federation Council, Sergei Mironov, said, "The FSB slept through it, and the Interior Ministry simply sold out the interests of the Republic and the people of Kondopoga." Decide for yourself what he meant. Passport slavery. Was there slavery in the USSR? Officially, of course, no. Unofficially, however, a third of the country's population lived under conditions similar to serfdom for 40 years. Judge for yourself. It all began in 1932 with the introduction of a unified passport system. Passports were issued to everyone. Townspeople and workers were included, but peasants working on the newly created collective farms were not. Collectivization, the policy of uniting single-person peasant farms into collective farms, had just been carried out. I have a video about that too. So, passports were given to everyone except the peasants who had recently been robbed of their land. Of the tens of millions of peasants, only those living within a 100-kilometer radius of the western border of the Union, near Moscow and Leningrad, or within 50 kilometers of Kharkov could obtain a passport. Others could not. What did it mean to live without a passport in the Soviet Union? It meant that you couldn't legally leave your village. To go to the city, you had to ask the chairman of the collective farm for permission. He could refuse for any reason. What if you left without permission? The first time you would receive a huge fine. The second time you could be imprisoned for up to 3 years. The system was simple. You were tied to your land. To leave the collective farm, adult peasants had only a few options. To enlist for hard labor such as logging, to go to the city to study before the age of 16, or to join the army. In 1967, according to the USSR Ministry of Public Order Protection, nearly 58 million people, or about 37% of the population, lived without passports. Of course, admirers of the USSR find excuses for this. That passports in cities were necessary for control, so that criminal elements did not stretch to the cities, that passports was not so important in the USSR, but the fact remains. For 40 years, 1/3 of the country's population was chained to their collective farms, having no right to free movement, and at the same time was obliged to work under the threat of the Article for Social Parasitism. Isn't that slavery? Lenin and Zinoviev were lovers. My favorite topic, the passionate love of politician. Yes, the LGBTQ community is an extremist organization, we condemn it. Today, let's discuss the secret affair between Vladimir Lenin and his loyal associate Grigory Zinoviev. Where did the rumors about Grandpa Lenin's orientation come from? Strangely enough, they came from Lenin's official biography. Everyone knows about the famous shalash in Razliv, where Lenin hid from the provisional government. But we often forget that he wasn't alone, Zinoviev was with him. Trotsky recalls that they slept under the same code. Furthermore, there are more details. There are memoirs that claim Krupskaya caught them in Geneva and Lenin was forced to confess everything to her. As a faithful companion, she accepted his choice. There is even an entire correspondence between Lenin and Zinoviev, full of phrases like "join me and we will spend 2 wonderful days away from everything" and "come quickly, I'm waiting for you, my flower." And of course, the immortal "I'm kissing your Marxist booty." Okay, let's be serious. All of what I said about Krupskaya and the Marxist booty is a modern fake that has been on the internet for the last 10-15 years. It has nothing to do with reality. But the story about the heart is true. You decide for yourself what 2 grown men could do for weeks in complete isolation in a tiny hut. Aum Shinrikyo in Russia. Aum Shinrikyo, a banned terrorist organization, is a Japanese cult that became infamous for the 1995 Tsarian attack on the Tokyo subway system, which killed at least 14 people. Members of the cult believe that merging with God could be achieved by reaching a state of samadhi, nirvana. However, few people know that Russia welcomed this cult a few years earlier. At the peak of its popularity, experts estimated there were tens of thousands of Aum Shinrikyo supporters in Russia. In the early 1990s, the cult's leader, Serko Asahara, was a welcome guest in Russia. He met with the mayor of Moscow and the speaker of parliament. He gave lectures at Moscow State University and GIMO. For a small investment, cult members received a spot on the TV channel's network, an hour-long program on Radio Mayak, and the right to hold the ceremonies at the Olympic Stadium. Russians did not yet know that the guests' plans included the purchase of weapons and a gas attack on the Tokyo subway aimed at exterminating all sinners. Thus, the activities of the Russian branch of Aum Shinrikyo were not restricted until March 20, 1995. Later, during searches of the cult's facilities in Japan, a Soviet Mi-8 helicopter was found, among other things. Documents show that the group was interested in buying tanks and even nuclear weapons from Russia. The Japanese even accused Oleg Lobov, secretary of the Russian Security Council, of helping Asahara purchase weapons. After the Tokyo attack, it would seem that everything should have ended. The cult was officially banned in Russia. However, none of its leaders were arrested. Instead, it changed its name to Aleph. Formally, they renounced their leader and changed their goals, even established a special compensation fund to pay the victims of incidents related to the activities of Aum Shinrikyo. But in 2000, they showed their face. In June, as a result of a special FSB operation in Vladivostok, 3 members of the cult were detained, who were preparing a series of terrorist attacks and hostage-taking in Japan. An arsenal of weapons was discovered, including Kalashnikov assault rifles, explosive devices, TT pistols, boxes of explosives, and numerous maps and plans of crowded places in Tokyo and Osaka. An unsent letter to the Japanese Prime Minister was also found, demanding the release of Shoko Asahara and threatening more terrorist attacks. However, even after that, Aleph continued to exist. Only in 2016 it was recognized as a terrorist organization and banned. But is the threat over? According to the Japanese intelligence services, the cult didn't disappear anywhere. It just went back into the shadows, continuing to recruit supporters at yoga classes and on social networks. And why did one of the world's most dangerous cults feel at home in Russia for decades? The question remains open. Thanks for watching, and as always, a huge shout out to my biggest supporters: Yelizaveta Zakharova, Kirill, Klimuk, Zimon Böse, Petar Ilich, Marina Holiday, Lyudmila Ilyanova, and one more member who wished to remain anonymous. See you guys next time.